So the new Microsoft Flight Simulator just came out, and it's very, very good. But there's a problem. It's not the long loading times, and it's not the fact that it requires 128 gigs of RAM. It's that the game doesn't actually tell you how to play it. Now, this isn't necessarily a bad thing. There are plenty of games that want you to figure things out via, trial and error, and this tends to be a little bit more popular of an approach than the alternative. But the problem is that flying a plane isn't exactly intuitive. Sure, there are a bunch of engineering videos on the internet that'll teach you Bernoulli's principle and the relationship between thrust and drag, and there are a bunch of content creators on Twitch and YouTube who are veteran simmers and are going to teach you how to play Microsoft Flight Simulator. But how do you play Microsoft Flight Simulator and how does a plane fly are different questions than how do you fly a plane. And so what I'm going to attempt to do in this YouTube series is to try and teach you how to be a better Microsoft Flight Simulator player by teaching you how you actually fly a plane using Microsoft Flight Simulator. The game is proving to be incredibly popular, which is great, but I can only imagine how steep the learning curve must be for people who don't have any practical experience applying the principles of flight to the actual operation of an aircraft. And what I want for Microsoft Flight Simulator to be is to be the game that kind of does for all of these new players what all of these old, quasi-sim flight-adjacent games did for me when I was younger, right? I think video games can be an incredibly powerful tool to get people interested in new hobbies and to get people curious about a new thing that they might not otherwise learn about. But the thing with Microsoft Flight Simulator is that it can be the beginning and the end. It's a perfectly 1-to-1 ratio sim for the most part. There are a lot of people who are actual pilots who use Microsoft Flight Simulator editions to practice the things that they learn in ground school and in an actual cockpit. And so what I want to do is sort of demystify the actual practical operation of an aircraft using Microsoft Flight Simulator in order to reinforce what I hope this game does for all of the people who it's captured. Before we get started, though, just as a disclaimer, I am not a licensed pilot, nor am I an aerospace engineer, but I do have a degree in aviation. I work in the industry and have for quite some time, and I do have some flight experience. I have, taken off, flown, and landed an airplane with my own two hands. I think I'm what most people would just describe as a plane guy. Before we get started, though, unfortunately, we're going to have to go over some history. So at this point, powered flight is over 100 years old, but there's still a lot of people who don't know how airplanes work, despite almost everybody having been on one at this point. And I think that the answer as to why that is lies in the first few decades after the invention of powered flight. So the generally accepted story is that in 1903, the Wright Brothers flew their flyer at Kitty Hawk in North Carolina, thereby cracking the code of how do humans fly and ushering in the golden age of flight. But that's a very historically optimistic version of what actually happened. What often gets left out in the story of the Wright brothers is that most world governments, with the exception of Brazil and France, kind of weren't interested in this. They didn't think that it was anything that needed to happen, and if it did happen, they wouldn't have any use for it. So most people who were attempting to do powered flight at the time were just eccentric billionaires or fancy lads. And the Wright brothers really were no exception, right? They weren't physicists, they weren't sanctioned by the US government. They exist in popular American imagination as just two bicycle mechanics from Ohio, and that's exactly what they were. I'm actually trying to fly over where they did it, but the live weather is bad. I gotta change the weather sliders. There we go. Much better. So Wilbur and Orville Wright, two of the original Ohio guys, made a whole bunch of trips out to here, which at the time was a desolate spit of land out in the Atlantic, to essentially put wings on a motorcycle and push it off of a sand dune. And they were successful. On December 17th, 1903, the Wright brothers performed what is generally accepted to be the first documented powered flight. There are some disputing claims from some other people who say that they did it first, but I don't care. For the purposes of this series, who did it first doesn't matter as much as what happens next. Now that powered flight was proven to be a possibility, a lot of people who weren't taking interest earlier are now suddenly taking a lot of interest. I mean, there was basically an entirely unregulated frontier available to anybody who wanted to be a part of it. The Wright Brothers proved that you didn't have to be wealthy, and, the French and the Brazilians proved that you didn't have to be good at it to, get inside of a plane and start flying around. So what ended up happening was, the Wright Brothers weren't really businessmen. They had trouble securing a patent. A lot of the other people who were trying to fly around the same time ended up doing it later than the Wright Brothers, but ended up having better ideas as a result of waiting longer. And, there was just sort of this wild proliferation of flight in the next couple of years. There were also a lot of high-profile assassinations in the early decades of the 20th century that, resulted in a lot of warfare and culminated in the First World War. So with this ever-increasing threat of armed conflict and lack of national regulatory bodies meant that the people who flew were either in the military or were barnstormers or daredevils. This meant pilots didn't really have much formal study on aerodynamics, and learning how to fly was more oral tradition than scientific focus. After the war, the trend kind of continued. Flying remained a novelty for eccentrics, a lot of whom became famous, like Amelia Earhart, Charles Lindbergh, and Bessie Coleman. The U.S. finally decided to require pilot's licenses for pilots and airworthiness certificates for aircraft designers, but formal education was more or less left up to flight schools or whatever the military decided was important for pilots to learn, so it was still all very informal. Not to mention that a lot of federal aviation regulations kind of didn't come about until something bad happened that necessitated the government to look at something and, rule on it. So this was all very much trial by fire. And so I do think that the United States government's slowness to embrace and adopt and promote aviation, even as it became a more crucial form of, everything from transportation to mail delivery, it has a lot to do with the disconnect between the ubiquitousness of it and the lack of information people have about it. In 1944, a guy by the name of Wolfgang Langewiesche wrote a book called Stick and Rudder, which is kind of the preeminent text on how you fly a plane. And most people who even fly planes don't even know about it. But the book is very good and very helpful for people who are just learning how to fly. I'm going to be drawing heavily from it in this series, and next episode we're going to be exploring some of his more groundbreaking observations and start applying them to flight sim. But thank you for putting up with my introduction. I hope this series bridges the gap that exists for so many people who find Microsoft Flight Simulator to be frustrating or anti-intuitive. It's truly a wonderful game, and I do want to help it reach the audience it deserves. I hope you'll stick with me, and I'll see you next time.